So 15 years ago, I was running a children's art museum in Oakland, California. And we had artist residencies, and I was out at one of the schools where we had a residency. It was right after lunchtime, and I'm sitting in the office, and I'm waiting for the principal to come out. She's running late, and so I'm waiting. She finally emerges from her office, and she has that cranky look that only an elementary school principal can have. You know, she has the neck vein thing going, and there are these 3 little boys who are trailing behind her who looked so miserable. And so she dismisses them to the secretary, and she ushers me into the office, and she starts going off on the litany of reasons that recess was hell at her school. She's talking about how these 3 boys get in trouble every day, and they're not bad kids, but they're starting to see themselves as bad kids. She's describing how her teachers find every reason under the sun to be anywhere other than the schoolyard at recess. And she's talking about how she's genuinely concerned that the conflicts that happen out at recess are spilling into the classroom. So she's going on and on and on, and she finally comes up for a breath, and she looks at me and she says, "Can't you do something?" And I'm a little taken aback. I mean, I'm there to talk about this artist residency, but in this moment, I have a flash that when I was growing up in Washington, D.C., I would go to the Macomb Street playground every day after school, and there was this guy, Clarence, who worked for the city, and he didn't make a big political deal out of it, but Clarence made sure I got to play. If I was the only girl who wanted to play basketball or football, whatever it is, Clarence got me in the game. So in that moment, when Ms. Payton, the principal, said, "Can't you do anything?" I thought, oh, you know what? I could make it so that every kid has a Clarence. So fast forward 15 years, and the nonprofit that I started, Playworks, to basically make it possible for every kid in America to have a Clarence, is up and running in 23 cities, serving 120,000 kids every day, 300 schools full-time. And I'm very, very happy that we launched just now in Albuquerque, and we are in 7 schools full-time here. Yeah. We're serving 4,000 Albuquerque kids every day, and actually you might have met some of our coaches. They're here today volunteering as ushers, and they are out at the schools every day. Yes. They're out at the schools every day, really leveraging play and recess to really make learning and physical activity happen at those schools in a different kind of way. So, but when I think back 15 years ago to that moment in Ms. Payton's office, the thing that really strikes me, right, is that when she asked me to help solve that problem with her, the way I did it was through identifying with the students, right? I didn't think about some theoretical thing I'd learned. I actually put myself in their shoes. I thought, well, what did I want when I was that age? What would I want if I were they? And I gotta tell you, as straightforward as that seems as a way to solve the problems, that's not what I'm seeing when we come to education reform and how we make plans for building schools. And fundamentally, after 15 years of being in this business and being out all over the country, I think that's at the root of our problems. I think until we're willing to acknowledge that kids in America's schools, kids in our schools are more like the people in this room than they're not. So I want to dig in a little bit to that, and so to do that, I'm going to do some informal polling. So I need you to bring up the house lights. Lights rising. Okay, or not. Yeah, okay, there we go. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and just throw up your hands if you feel like you say yes to this question. So the first question is, if you would describe your relationship with choice about your environment, that you like a lot of it, that on the que sera control freak continuum, you lean towards control freak. Raise your hands. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, next question. If you would say that, given your choice, you really like mastery, that you really want to really learn and be challenged, raise your hand. Right on. Okay. Next question is, if you would say that when you were a kid that there was one grown-up, non-parental grown-up, who really saw you and they really advocated on your behalf and made you feel special, raise your hand. Okay. And for those of you who just raised your hand, if you thought at that time or think now that they did that because they identified somewhat with you, raise your hand. Okay. Last question. If you are a non-parental grown-up or have ever been a non-parental grown-up in some kid's life that you feel like you made them feel special, raise your hand. Okay. Great. Okay. You can bring the lights back down. You can tell where I fit on the que sera control freak continuum. So The first two questions, right? It's not particularly surprising that with this audience that you'd like a high degree of control and that you'd like a challenge, right? Those are sort of softball questions. But the thing about it is if you look at kids and the enthusiasm they bring to playing games, it points to exactly the same thing. The philosopher Bernard Suits said he defined a game as being the voluntary attempt to overcome an unnecessary challenge. Isn't that great? I mean, they choose it, it's a challenge. It's no longer should you think of play as being the opposite of work or the purview of slackers. It is the fundamental sign of our inner drive and ambition. Most of us in this room, we grew up when what John Dewey described as informal education was still alive and well. Informal education is that time out of class, mixed stage. It's the way groups teach their newest members the social norms. It's where we learned empathy and teamwork and leadership. It's where you have those experiences that actually ultimately teach you that, generally speaking, success comes from a whole series of failures. For those of you who raised your hand that you had a Clarence, that's most likely the context in which you had that grown-up interact and stand up for you. But informal education, just like Dewey predicted 100 years ago, the structure has really fallen away. Our society has changed. And kids come to school without those basic skills. They come to school not really knowing how to play. And the implications for schools are very, very intense. If we were going to build together a school that worked for you and me, it'd be a place where academic rigor was at the center, right? That would be the challenge. But it would be taught in an environment where you had some choice and some say over how and what you learned, where you were getting really constant feedback that enabled you to be in control of the learning. And it would be done in a social milieu which allowed you to know and be known by others, making up for the fact that there is less informal education out of school hours. That's not what we're building when we're building schools. That's not what it looks like. We're building schools where when you talk about control, it's about controlling kids, not about giving them more control. It's about, when you talk about feedback, the most prominent form of feedback in schools right now is high stakes and aimed much more at assessing teaching than it is promoting learning. And when you talk about the social things, you talk about with school staff, they throw up their hands. They're so overwhelmed. Stuff that's happening outside the classroom, oh my gosh, please don't ask them. So bad news, good news. The bad news, I believe if we keep going down this way, we're going to raise the most alienated, antisocial generation any of us have ever seen. And I would offer that the rise in bullying that we've seen, both the very publicized cases of middle school kids bullying, but also the bullying we see in politics and sports among adults, I think it's just a preview of things to come. The good news is we know how to fix it. Programs like Playworks have data that show that when you have academic rigor that's supported by programs that really value and teach the skills around empathy and teamwork and leadership, the learning there is much richer. And the extra double bonus about that is that not only do you solve the education crisis, you're raising a generation with the vision and the collective will to make all the other changes that we need. You've been hearing people talk all day. We have no shortage of solutions. We have a leadership crisis. People are going to tell you that we can't afford it, that empathy is too expensive. And I'm here to tell you that's simply not true. It's a question of choices. It's a question of priorities. And I think you have to ask yourself, really, truly, what is the greatest threat to our national security? And I say it with lots of love and respect. In fact, I think we owe it to both our soldiers and our teachers to build schools where you and I would want to go. At the very least, we need to build schools. In fact, at the very least, it's a moral imperative to build schools where we would send our own children. About a year ago, President Obama gave Bill Russell the Medal of Freedom. And for those of you who are not basketball fans, Bill Russell is this extraordinary human and an amazing basketball player. He played for the Celtics, total game changer. Grew up in Oakland where I live, and they threw him a big party, right, because he won the Medal of Freedom. And he came and he told all these really great stories. But my favorite story that he told was about when he was a player and the Vietnam War was going on. And he was going around and talking. He was giving this one speech, and he said, basically, that he hoped that when the war was over, that the government would take all the money they'd been spending on the conflict and to pour it into public education. Because he believed that if really protecting democracy was the goal, this was the best way to do it. So, yeah, you gotta love Bill Russell. So, after the talk, right, this guy comes up to him and asks for his autograph, and then he says, "Oh, Mr. Russell, I really enjoyed your talk, but I gotta disagree with you on one point. I mean, why should the federal government spend all my money on other people's children?" And I like to picture Bill Russell, he's all 6'11", he's all looking down on the dude, and he says, "Sir, in America, there are no other people's children." Thank you very much.